Well, let's get started. Welcome, everyone. Again, I'm Ellen Weiss. I'm the president of the board of FIJ, and we are really thrilled to be partnering today with IRE for a very timely, I would say urgent webinar about how to get records to cover U.S. immigration actions. We're going to be talking about data resources. You're going to be getting reporting tips, hear about legal help, but I just wanted to take a minute to offer our condolences to the IRE community and staff for the very sudden loss of their executive director, the mentor, friend, Diana Fuentes. It's a huge loss for our community, so our sincerest condolences. Just a note, our mission at FIJ is to support independent and nonprofit journalists to produce high quality, unbiased investigative stories with impact. And we actually want to give you money to do this work. I'm going to share my screen for just a minute because I want to review the grants that we have available. Normally, I would spend a lot more time on this, but I know that let me just do this. I know that we have a lot to get to today. So let me just go back way back to the beginning. Here we go. We have different kinds of grants, right? For preliminary reporting, we have seed grants, that's up to $2,500. This is for the early reporting that you do. We have regular grants up to $10,000. We offer follow-up grants for $2,500. And we now have Alicia Patterson fellowships that offer up to $40,000. There's all this information is available on our website. And I just want to let you know that we have some deadlines coming up. April 27th for our regular and our seed grants and our follow-up grants. And again, you can find all of this on our website. So I do hope that one of the things that happens as a result of this webinar is that we see a lot more applications for grants from all of you, which would be really wonderful. Let me stop sharing. Okay, just a little bit of housekeeping also. Um, we have three great guests. You can see them on the screen. I'll introduce them individually. I'm going to prompt them with questions for about 20 or 30 minutes. If you have questions, please just add them whenever they occur to the Q&A section. Our goal is to leave a lot of time to answer those questions. Also, we are recording this webinar. We're going to post it on the FIJ website. It will include links to full slide presentations that some of our guests are drawing from today. It will also be included in our newsletter. So the bottom line is, if you don't want to take notes, you are safe. The recent immigration crackdown that began with the Trump administration that took office in 2025 has really reshaped so much our communities, the lives of millions of people across the country, and our newsrooms. The numbers are staggering. I don't dare share too many numbers with this esteemed group, except to be reminded that the One Big Beautiful Bill Act roughly tripled the annual budget for ICE to over 75 billion, and that includes 45 billion just for new detention centers. Now we know this isn't just a story about numbers, it's about families, it's about communities, democracy, human rights. And for journalists, for anyone trying to cover this story, it's vast, it's fast moving, it's hard to cover. And yet, I think we all feel that there's never been a more urgent time to cover it and to get it right. And so we are so grateful to have three guests today to help us continue to cover the story in our local communities, in states and regions, and across the country. And so while we're putting extra attention on finding and gating data and documents, we're also going to hear about some of the innovative ways to cover this issue at the local level and actually some of the ethical challenges you may face while doing this coverage. We've kind of organized this discussion around three big buckets or questions. What data exists? Where can I find it? How can I use it? What are some of the creative ways to make your own data? And as you'll hear, the reporter may not even feel that it's data. And then what's the best strategy for what data and documents to request, and how to do it. So that's kind of how we're moving through this. Um, I would love just a prompt for all of you out there. Is there one question that you've tried to answer about the immigration crackdown where you couldn't find the data you needed? You can just drop that in the chat, so others can see, because I think this is a challenge that many, many of us have faced. So, question number one, what data exists? Well, when it comes to data journalism, Sarah Cohn is a legend. She's a Pulitzer Prize winning reporter and editor. She's worked at the New York Times, the Washington Post. She's a career in teaching at Duke and at the Cronkite School at ASU. And I'm very honored to say she's a member of the FIJ board. But recently, Sarah's been working with Stanford University's Big Local News. And as part of that work, she's been doing training on something called the Deportation Data Project. This is like a centralized repository of individual level US government immigration enforcement data. It's based at UC Berkeley. They're working in collaboration with UCLA's Center for Immigration Law and Policy. Again, we're going to have a link to everything about how you can access this project. Where Sarah does some really in-depth training on how you can sign up for this. But Sarah, let me begin with you by just like asking you for kind of a short description of the Deportation Data Project, and then for a reporter new to immigration enforcement, what do you think are like the first two or three data sets from the project that you would think they should explore and why? And again, I'm going to share my screen because Sarah does have some slides, but Sarah, take it away.
Sure. So the project, I'm just going to call it the project, so we don't have to say that over and over. But the project has been fighting the federal government for more than 10 years to try to get this data. And what the basic data collection is, it's from ICE, not from any other part of the enforcement system right now. And it's a list of every single arrest, detention, and a couple of other things that ICE has recorded in the last about 2 years or so. Right now, it's a little out of date. They have to do a lawsuit every time they want an update to the data. And I haven't spoken with them specifically about this. You can just go to the next slide, Alan, just so they can see what that looks like.
Sure, sure.
Um, and the they have to do a lawsuit every time they want an update to the data. And my guess is that's going nowhere while the DHS is still closed down. So it's about 5 months old now. We hope that soon, I mean, they're actively working to try to get it done. Um, what we have done at Big Local News is take this data that they have posted and tried to make it a little bit easier. We've created a reporting guide for it. If you want to go to the next slide, is a guide to effectively the deportation data for local reporters. And right now we focused on arrests. I plan to get detentions and detainers up there pretty soon. So what that guide has something that's a little bit more focused on local reporters. It's filled in some of the geography that's missing in the original data so that it's more relevant to local reporters and has a little bit less error. And it's kind of put together some of the data sets that are a little bit difficult to put together and then simplified some of the things that are just very confusing about it. So that's the goal, is to make this so that you can just go to one place, download your state or your county, well, depending on what it is, but generally download your area and start looking through the information that it has. If you want to go to the next slide, just in terms of what's contained in it, um, just define a couple terms. Arrests are arrests by ICE, not Customs and Border Patrol, so that's a huge hole right there. As a result of what's called administrative warrants, which means that it doesn't count people that we don't think it counts people who are generally just stumbled on in the streets, including US citizens. So it's got a lot of holes in it, but it still gives you a good sense of the trends. One of the biggest trends in there is the growth, the thing that we all see ourselves in our communities is an enormous growth in what they call street arrests rather than arrests from jails and prisons. And that's where we see everything, and that's really where the big changes. So that's one really big thing. Detentions lists every time somebody was booked in and out of detention. Some of the best stories on that one have been done on the horrible conditions that people are held in usually the first few days after they're arrested. These are facilities that don't have, and Nicole's going to probably go into this much more, but they don't have cots, they don't have showers, they don't have anything. And it used to be that you could only leave people in there for 12 hours, but now they can leave them in there for 3 days, and they are leaving them in there for 3 days and longer. So that's one of the key ones. And those ones are very specific because these places are a specific place. You can get information about your county from them. Detainers is another one that people are starting to pay more attention to. The people I talk to are getting really interested in. These are the notes that the federal government sends to your local jail and says, hey, you have somebody we want. We hold them for another 48 hours and we'll either pick them up or ask you to transfer them to a place that you are being paid to hold them for us. So it kind of turns into this thing where somebody in jail goes across the hall after they're done, after they get out of jail. Instead of going home, they go across the hall and now they're in ICE detention instead. And the county's being paid for them to do that. So that's a really good local story. The data is very spotty on that one. And then they also have removals and encounters, which are very spotty, and I wouldn't worry about them too much. There are a couple things in there that are useful. So that's the main one. They have had some luck with Customs and Border Patrol, but not much. And so that hasn't been updated in a while, and it's not linkable. They also have plans at the project to post data on immigration court proceedings. There's a database that's very detailed on court dockets that's anonymous, but very detailed that the Justice Department puts out. It's very difficult to use. And I was talking with the folks at the project the other day, and they're very close to posting something that's more useful. So that's really what they have. If you want to just go to the next one. There are a couple alternative sources for simpler things. You'll get this slide, but there's a place called Relevant Research that's created a dashboard that you can look at and just download like general trends. And the Vera Institute does has like a very long history on detention centers going back to 2008 on summary information on detention centers. One more slide, I think. I think we wanted to talk a little bit about the stories. Ellen, do you want to hold off
Yeah.
on that or?
No, no, that's okay, because I was going to ask you if maybe you could walk us through sort of
Yeah,
one concrete example of a story that started
I
with
think that one of
data.
the best local stories is the one that I'm highlighting up there from the Colorado Sun. They did this amazing story where they were able to mesh the data with their on-the-ground reporting in a way that really told you a lot about what was going on. They were able to link the data back to a specific raid on, I believe it was a nightclub, and they followed the people from that nightclub using them as a vehicle to work through the data in that area. So if there's one story I think that you might want to take a look at as a model for a local story, that's the one. The other reason to do that, the other reason to look at that one is it's about arrests rather than detentions and detainers. And it happens that although the arrests are not the richest data set in this collection, it is the easiest one to understand and to use. So if you want to start with something pretty simple, the arrest ones are reasonably simple, and there are some really good models on how to use it out there. Um, I think that some of the best ones that have come out since the data got a little stale, is what happened after specific events. The Marshall Project one is done here, which is basically looking at 1,600 people detained during the Chicago Blitz and what happened to them. Were they deported? Were they released? What happened? Where did they get sent? How far away did they get sent? How long did it take? And of course, knowing the New York Times did this incredible piece on the entire system, the detention, what they called the deportation machine that follows people all through the system and goes through it. So those are three really good example stories using different parts of the collection. If you go to the news section of the project and the deportation data project, they have a whole list of stories. They got a gazillion stories. And please, if you do a good story, send it to them. They'd love to be able to catalog and to amplify your work. Um, But I've also written a little walkthrough for people on how to use some of the arrest data um, in the Google Sheets in a simple way, and it explains all of the data terms and everything. So you can go to that and look at that. I plan to add something for detentions and detainers over the next month or so as the new data comes out. But that's
Sarah,
what I,
what, thank you. That's really super helpful. And again, all of these slides and Sarah's longer training will all be available. But I wonder if you could just kind of tick off some common misinterpretations that you see reporters, like when reporters first use this kind of data, what are some common misinterpretations and how can they avoid those pitfalls?
yeah, I mean, some of it, I mean, the biggest pitfall is that we have no ability to get any documentation on any of this data. And so all of the documentation is basically your experiences as reporters, and you tell us what's wrong with it and what's right with it. So I think taking what's in the data a little too literally, as if it is like, God-given truth. As an example, we often see arrests happening after a detention, where they write down the arrest later on, a day or two later on. They don't record it at the same time. Um, Confusing arrests and detentions is one kind of terminology thing that people kind of stumble over a lot. Whereas an arrest is when ICE goes and takes somebody, and detention is where they put them. And not everybody who's arrested go into detention, and not everybody in detention is arrested. So they're not always going to match. And that's another area of confusion. Um, and the last one that I think is kind of hard to understand that I still don't understand, and Nicole may know more about this than I do, but kind of trying to figure out what some of these things mean. As an example, there's one column in the data that talks about um, street arrest. There's one column where it says street arrest as one of the options on like what they've filled out. And if you filter for that, there's like none of them. They don't exist. Um, the reason is that that's not the column where you would actually find street arrests. So it's like, and street arrests aren't called street arrests. So kind of learning the terminology. Some of the big errors in the data set, I have looked through every piece of this data set and never once found a US citizen. We know that's a lie, right? We totally know that's wrong, but I have no idea what happened to them, whether or not they're calling them a citizen of somewhere else, or they're just pretending they never did it. I don't know. We don't know the answer to that. Um, and some of the other things is kind of making an assumption about things. One of the things that I've been kind of obsessed with, which I think we might be able to fix in a future release, is finding dreamers. And one of the things we don't know from the arrest data is when somebody entered the country. And kind of assuming you know when they entered the country based on their age is very different things. So kind of trying not to make that leap. But it's really a definitional problem, as in any data system. Understanding the definitions of what you're looking at is the hardest thing.
Great, great, thank you. I would love if people just want to throw into the chat, how many of you have worked on with a national immigration data set and then tried to localize it. You can just, throw in if you've done it and what it was. There is one question, it looks time urgent because this person's on deadline, so I'm going to throw it to you, Sarah. This is from, I've been using this data for a couple of stories I'm working on about deportation, but there's a discrepancy between what's here and what I got from the country where people were deported. I have a story due tomorrow where I'm using the data, trying to explain the difference in numbers, but just want to know if I should be including something else to explain.
I think that I think that I would not spend not one more minute trying to make the numbers match.
Awesome.
Because we have no idea exactly what the other country is working off of, and we have really no idea how precisely accurate it is. So as long as that they're like somewhere in the same ballpark of a very general, within hundreds, I would say, rather than even tens, I wouldn't spend one more minute on that.
Excellent, excellent. Okay, well, thank you. Plenty time for questions, but I am going to turn to our next guest, and Nicole Foy. So Nicole Foy covers immigration at ProPublica, and she has a particular focus on how immigration enforcement changes communities around the country. And back in 2025, Nicole, just on her own, started tracking the number of US citizens being detained by ICE. It was just a spreadsheet in her computer, not an assignment, sort of just something she was curious about. She set up some Google alerts. It was kind of hard to find examples, she thought. And that's because the government, as Sarah said, doesn't track these cases. But by June, there were more than 100 names on her spreadsheet. And by the time she published her story in October, there were more than 170. In the story that Nicole wrote, I really love this line: tallying the number of Americans detained by immigration agents is inherently messy and incomplete. And so, Nicole, I would love for you to walk us through how you went about navigating that really messy and incomplete process and coming up with the number 170.
Yeah, well, I think one of the reasons too why it's so messy and incomplete is because the basic ground level when it comes to citizens getting caught up in immigration enforcement is that this is a problem that our country has had for more than 100 years, sometimes on purpose, sometimes not. But it's been a problem, and it has been a problem that was briefly discussed and even the subject of some congressional subpoenas in the first Trump administration, because there were some high-profile cases of people held in detention, held in detainers on detainers in local jails for months because of immigration enforcement. And this was mostly a combination of things: a local cop or a ICE official who was absolutely convinced that this person was not a US citizen, that their birth certificate was fake, that there was, something, there was a people problem at the problem. Then there was also some like very obvious racial profiling incidents too, where someone was pulled because of the way that they spoke English or something like that. But also there was just this huge problem with the system that ICE in particular was using to track and to find out if someone was who they say they were. And so you have that ground level coming into this first Trump administration where it's already very common for someone to be held for days, even weeks, just because they have the same name in the database or their citizenship status has not updated in whatever system they're using, because there's no comprehensive system to track citizenship and criminal records across all these agencies. So you come in, and on top of that, you bring in an incredibly aggressive and increasingly aggressive enforcement plan across the country, where not just ICE, who usually handled interior enforcement, and not just CBP, who, although at the border certainly dealt with their fair number of tracking, verifying citizenship, are now being fanned out into communities across the country where they've never had a presence. But you also, too, have this infusion of officers from the FBI, from DEA, from ATF, who are participating in arrests of both immigrants and people who eventually turned out to be citizens. And their presence makes people think, well, this must be a valid arrest. This must be something to do with crime, because why would the ATF be breaking into a car window on the side in a random neighborhood if there wasn't some type of gun violation? And what we found doing a number of other stories that kind of interacted with this is that had nothing to do actually with any of that. It's simply that um, every tool at the government's disposal is being turned towards immigration enforcement, and these agencies are blending together. So I had been tracking the number of U.S. citizens who have been detained since January, when a enforcement push from former Border Patrol Chief Gregory Bravino ran through my hometown, Bakersfield, California. I couldn't get anybody to care about it. It felt like. Now a lot of people have written about this, of course, but it was because it was before Trump hadn't even taken office yet. It wasn't technically the Trump administration, but many of the tactics that were used there, including breaking of car windows to pull people over, randomly racially profiling huge groups of farm workers and people going to work, and the detentions of several U.S. citizens who were either in vehicles with undocumented targets or just apparently racially profiled because they looked like someone who they were trying to detain. And from there, I started counting the number of US citizens just because it was helpful for me trying to make sense of everything that was going on across the country and figure out where my lane was. Um, and one of the things that became incredibly clear was that one, we had absolutely no idea how ICE or all of these other agencies were recording these arrests, many, almost all of which are recorded on someone's cell phone video, someone's neighbor, they've recorded themselves being pulled out and dragged out of their car or vehicle while they screamed that they were a US citizen. There was very often that ICE or DHS would insist that this had never happened, or start putting forward a claim that eventually became very common to explain the arrests of US citizens, which is to say this person was assaulting an officer and they were detained because ICE officers, even though they're normally doing immigration enforcement, if they see a felony committed in front of them, they then have the right, as any federal law enforcement officer, to stop them from committing a felony. This was increasingly used for the arrest of U.S. citizens who, especially those who were filming themselves. It was incredibly clear we're not doing anything that matched with what statement ICE or DHS would put out. But yeah, so just started tracking a number of these, asking repeatedly for the entirety of last year. I asked repeatedly, filed records requests, many that I don't have back yet, on like how many citizens have been detained. It became incredibly clear too that it is not clear how many of these arrests are actually being recorded, as Sarah talked about, in any manner. Usually they're in past administrations, it was common for ICE to, at the very least, record when they arrested someone who appeared to have a country of origin being United States, or they had claimed it. But I genuinely do not know if they are still doing that. There are many things that we're not sure if they're doing completely. We don't know how much they're tracking use of force. We don't know how much they're tracking the detentions of children, or what they're even counting as a detention or arrest. So we decided to just count ourselves and what mattered to, I think, like in the sense of like what mattered to the general public. ICE may not consider cuffing someone after pulling them out of the side of the car and making them sit on, outside of their car for 2 hours in handcuffs, unable to leave, as an arrest. But that is certainly what the general public would consider feeling under arrest. They're being held against their will, they're handcuffed, and they can't go where they would like to go. Also, too, we of course had many people who were being detained for several days. It was very common for someone to get arrested at a protest or at a worksite enforcement or on the street, absolutely disappear for several days, and not show up in any local jail tracker, not show up on the ICE locator list, of course, because they are a US citizen and they don't have an A number and so aren't getting added into that system. And so would just disappear for days until they were released and their family found them again. So we just started tracking that. And like Ellen said, I got to a point where I had done 2 stories on this and I was kind of like a little bit over it because I didn't seem like anybody cared about it. I always give props to my editor because he was saying, you should do an update on this story. And I said, people didn't care about it last time. Like, I don't know. Like, maybe I want to work on this other thing. And he was just like, you're telling me you have more than 100. If you really have more than 100 people on this spreadsheet, that's a story. And so I came back and I was like, actually, it's like way more than 100 people. And at that point, there was beginning this immigration push into Chicago, where we saw vast numbers of US citizens pulled. I feel like I'm getting a little bit off topic here, but
Let me ask you a question,
yeah.
and this was a question that came up, which is,
Mhm.
you both had a really high standard for who made your list and who didn't make your list,
Mhm.
but more importantly, how did you verify that these people were American citizens, and how did
Mhm.
you verify that what happened to them? Because it was so hard to pull that information together. So maybe you could
Mhm.
talk a little bit about like the process that you created, because this was really innovative. It didn't exist, and it's something that you created, and you had to kind of create the guardrails around it too.
Mhm. Yeah, I think one of the things is because we were drawing so strongly from either our own reporting or like local other local reporting that we were aggregating and pulling together. The one of the standards that we sent early was just that like a video is not good enough. If all we have is a video of someone saying that they're a U.S. citizen and getting arrested, that's not good enough. There has to be follow-up reporting. We have to contact the person directly. We have to seek some sort of proof of citizenship. But honestly, what made things very good for me and very lucky is that there has been incredible local reporting across the country that has already gathered many of those things. It was incredibly, there's not a single person on my list that had just a video and hadn't been reported by multiple other outlets who then went to the source and were able to present proof of citizenship, and you could easily look up and find those same credentials. One of the other ways that I gathered people was that increasingly, as people were being arrested at protests or around protests, that many of them weren't even protesting, they were making huge splashy announcements on like local U.S. attorneys' websites about them being indicted for assaults on officers. These are folks in Portland who were accused of everything from hurting an ATF officer's finger to throwing a Molotov cocktail, which is of course like that's not in the same level, but going through and finding out actually how many of these people, even though like the FBI was the one presenting the complaint, going through the individual complaints, I read so many court records of so many people arrested this way, and seeing that they were actually initially arrested by a CBP officer. They were initially arrested by an ICE officer. And so kind of just like the thing that we decided to set out just to cover is people who were held against their will and were arrested in these street arrests that, as Sarah laid out, the government is not really saying that they have any and but we are watching them happen with our very eyes. And also we ended up ruling out some other groups of people too, that just for our purposes we decided like we wanted to be very narrow, which was that they had to be arrested on the scene. There are a number of other US citizens who have been arrested for um, conspiracy charges or like really serious assault charges, many of whom have already been acquitted of those charges. But they were not arrested on the scene. They came after some level of investigation, bringing other agencies in, and usually having a judicial warrant and not just an officer arresting someone in the road or at a protest. We really wanted to show the scope um, of how often immigration officers who usually have next to nothing to do with US citizens, unless it's a mistake in their own system, are now exerting powers that they did have, but usually did not touch until this year, to thus detain Americans, sometimes for days at a time, and you know, whether for legitimate purposes or purposes that people would say were trying to cover their tracks, only releasing those Americans with charges that they then had to fight in court, whether or not they were valid. So yeah.
Yeah. Just briefly, because I really love your compliment of the local reporting, because it really does sound like what you're doing is super hard because you're a national reporter, but that this work would absolutely be replicable in a local newsroom to do this kind of work. Is that
Yeah.
agree?
Absolutely. I actually think this work is easier, being a relative term in this time, but like is easier and better done in local newsrooms. If I had one state to focus on for these types of things, this would be much better. You guys, like local reporters, the court systems, where the immigrant communities are that also have a large number of US citizens who are experiencing racial profiling and things that they will never tell anyone. I mean, we know this is a vast undercount, and not just because I have a list of like 30 people now where I know pretty well that they were detained and arrested and sometimes even held for days to a week. But they don't want to talk about it. This is an incredibly scary thing for people to talk about, especially if they are the only US citizen in their family, in which many people are. But you know these neighborhoods, these communities much better, and it's you just have a much like a much more laser focused on something that you can then be a really great resource for others. I mean, I am working on updating my list from last year right now, and I'm absolutely benefited by how much reporters, especially in places like Chicago and Minnesota, have been spending the time tracking the number of U.S. citizens that have been arrested in their area. That I mean, I had to publish at the very beginning of the October surge in Chicago, and so like there was a lot that I didn't know and a lot of cases that I didn't even grab from Chicago. But people who were there and watched U.S. citizens get dragged out of the protests into ICE vehicles, and later people denied that this had ever happened. They're doing a really important work that I'm just trying to build on and amplify.
Great, thank you. Just a prompt for everyone out there, like if you have figured out some offbeat source that you used or could use to construct your own data set, maybe it was obits, maybe it was church bulletins, Facebook groups, just throw it in the chat, share it with everyone. On to the last topic, which is tips for requesting data, your rights. Ganita Singh is a staff attorney with the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press. And among the many services they provide, the Reporters Committee attorneys have represented newsrooms in lawsuits against the federal government to obtain deportation records and advocate for press rights during a lot of these immigration-related protests coverage. Ganita is also one of the authors of the Reporter Committee's Immigration Reporting Legal Guide, which is kind of a soup to nuts document to learn how to navigate our very complex immigration system. Ganita, we are putting a lot of emphasis sometimes on FOIA and on government data, but how fruitful or effective do you think these kinds of efforts are when we're trying to report on immigration enforcement? Like, is it worth filing FOIAs?
100%. Absolutely. If you don't mind popping over to my slides, I feel like they could be a little bit helpful in this conversation. So, look, in the
I
context,
I don't know that I got your slides, so let me search for them.
okay.
But
In that
you
case,
you talk, I'll
I'll
look for
talk.
them.
Okay, sounds good. So, yes, as Ellen mentioned, the Reporters Committee published a comprehensive guide on everything ranging from how to access records related to immigration enforcement from all of the relevant agencies, including Department of Homeland Security, ICE, CBP, USCIS, Executive Office for Immigration Enforcement Review, all of the relevant agencies. And while we already had an existing guide called the FOIA Wiki, that's foia.wiki, and that's going to be your North Star for everything related to federal FOIA. Our additional guide on accessing immigration enforcement records is going to be a little bit more in the weeds with respect to everything that everyone's been talking about right now with those agencies I just mentioned. I'll note that there's also a section there on accessing proceedings that have to do with immigration enforcement, and there's also a section on your rights when it comes to filming law enforcement officers who are in uniform in public executing their officially prescribed duties. So just, again, going to be your North Star if this is your beat. The FOIA Wiki, though, has a lot of helpful information on how do you identify the relevant records custodian? How do you go about crafting a strongly worded FOIA request? Because Ellen understandably asked, is it worth it? Because any of us who engage in public records work, we're going to be faced with delays and stonewalling, and the process can feel quite disillusioning at times. But I will say that the more research you do at the outset, just Googling the organizational chart for the agency to figure out, okay, what are the relevant subcomponents, programmatic offices, that is going to streamline the request down the road. If you Google ICE FOIA reading room or FBI FOIA reading room or CBP FOIA reading room, it'll take you to online repositories of records that have already been processed and released under FOIA. Now, every single record that's been processed and released isn't going to be on there, but you can find a lot of stuff on there. And the reason that I mentioned that is because under federal FOIA, and all of the 50 states have their own equivalent of this, your records request needs to be reasonably described. So, how do you reasonably describe something if you're not even 100% sure what's out there? This is where doing all the research you can at the outset is going to help, right? Some of these agencies with tremendous backlogs, like ICE, like the State Department, like CBP, they're getting dozens, if not hundreds, of FOIA requests a day. So, the more that you can do to hold their hand through the process, okay, I know exactly what this person is asking. I'm going to forward it off to this records custodian. It's going to mitigate some of the delays that have become so pernicious in this process. So if we go to the next slide, I'll also note that each of the 50 states also has their own public records law, and some of them are modeled quite closely off of federal FOIA, but some of them might be different. So definitely check out the Reporters Committee Open Government Guide, which is going to have the ins and outs of all of the 50 states plus DC's public records law. And this will be relevant for rounding out your immigration reporting. Maybe there is a local police department that is working in conjunction with ICE at the federal level. Try requesting their body-worn camera footage under the state public records law. Maybe there's a federal-state partnership and you are seeking email correspondence or other electronic correspondence between the federal entity and the state entity. I once had a case where I sought records from the FBI as well as the San Francisco Police Department, and presumably I should have gotten the emails between the SFPD and the FBI from the FBI if they actually conducted a diligent search, but they didn't. And so they came back to us and they said, oh, we didn't find anything. What did we do? We took the records that we got from the SFPD, showed that to the court, saying this is proof that the FBI did not conduct a search sufficiently calculated to uncover all responsive records. And then we ended up winning, and the court ordered the FBI to conduct a comprehensive search. So doing what I call multi-tiered requests is a really strategic way to round out your reporting and fill gaps, right? Because, federal state partnerships, there's a rich trove of records that you can get. And if we head to the next slide, just another plug for really doing all the research you can at the outset. The Reporters Committee is representing the Guardian US right now in a pro bono lawsuit against ICE. And our client, Will Kraft, who's a senior data editor at The Guardian, I mean, really, to talk to him, I'm sure he's all about collaboration, pick his brain. He and I were on a panel together in Indianapolis at NICAR where he kind of talked about his methodology. He scoured every single repository for information about how to reasonably describe this request. And he ended up working in conjunction with the University of Washington, who was already doing some pre-existing records requesting on a topic relevant to the Guardian's ongoing project. So don't reinvent the wheel. Talk to folks who are already engaged in interesting work. Go to Muckrock, where there are full administrative histories of what's already been done before. Reach out to those folks, see what worked and what didn't. And I'm very proud to report that we've been able to get thousands of pieces of data in dozens of Excel spreadsheets that has helped our client, The Guardian, to produce really world-class reporting where they were able to challenge this official narrative that we're out here deporting the worst of the worst and only the most violent offenders, because we got data showing that of the over 100,000 people that have been deported to date, fewer than 25% of them even had a prior criminal conviction. And of that, roughly 23% of prior criminal convictions, half of those were violent. So the data speaks for itself, right? In an age where people are accusing this media and that media being biased or, filtering in their perspective, the data speaks for itself. So I really cannot recommend enough pursuing your work through FOIA and also state public records laws. But look, you are going to face obstacles from time to time, and that's where litigation comes in. So I just wanted to take a moment to explain the benefits of going into court. And if you think, oh, I can't afford, the Reporters Committee offers entirely free public records litigation. So absolutely, reach out to me, reach out through the Reporters Committee hotline. If you just Google RCFP hotline, you'll find it. This case, it's a few years old. It predates the kind of current events that we've been talking about. But one of the exemptions that you might run into if you're trying to get records related to immigration enforcement proceedings is Exemption 7E, which under the federal FOIA has to do with law enforcement techniques and procedures, which, if disclosed, presumably could lead to circumvention of the law. So a lot of times agencies like the FBI, like ICE, like CBP, they're going to be saying, we can't give this to you because if criminals were to get a hold of this information, then, it would lead to circumvention of the law. But when you get into court and there's judicial oversight over the propriety of those exemption claims, you can get some really powerful results. So in this case, the ACLU sought records about the Department of Homeland Security's surveillance of social media to engage in sustained tracking of both citizens and non-citizens, particularly with respect to immigrants and visa applicant social media. And the plaintiff, ACLU, contended that these agencies had acquired social media monitoring software that gave them full access to Twitter and other data, searchable using customizable filters that would then be used to fulfill purportedly national security functions. And they really highlighted the public interest in this information, right? There are basic due process and fairness implications that are undermined when decisions affecting people's lives are influenced by completely secret algorithms. So the record saw included information concerning the acquisition of these surveillance technologies, machine learning processes, something that's in the news now way more than it was in 2019 when this case was from, predictive analytics and more. And here the court explained the contours of this exemption, 7E, emphasizing that the exemption only shields investigation techniques that are not generally known to the public, which is true in essentially all jurisdictions that have examined this exemption, right, all over the country. But this court elaborated that the exemption only covers investigative techniques which are so unique as to warrant the exemption, which is really tight language compared to other jurisdictions. So it imposes a slightly more cabined interpretation of the exemption, which is good for us requesters. So if you have the opportunity to sue in the Northern District of California, definitely try. But this is really significant because the court's ruling that disclosure of social media surveillance is a general, well-known technique. So it wouldn't reveal the specific details of surveillance such that circumvention of the law would result. That's really important. And I strongly believe that part of what influenced the court's ruling is the fact that the ACLU really delved into the public interest here. So emphasizing the public interest in these types of records can really only help rather than hurt your cause. And the other thing I'll mention is I actually just discovered something literal minutes before this webinar that I want to put in the chat, which is a colleague of mine found that in an appropriations bill from 5 years ago, there is a mandate that ICE publicly post online their contracts with detention centers. And the fact that this is kind of my world and I didn't realize this until maybe 15 minutes ago, it really just shows the value of diving into those FOIA reading rooms. But yeah, Ellen, thank you so much for going to this slide. Just a couple of other things. Let's think outside the box in terms of the sort of records that we can seek, because emails and memoranda, been there, done that. But let's try call logs. Let's try calendar invites. Let's try obviously there are records retention issues posed by using things like WhatsApp and Signal and other disappearing or encrypted messaging apps, but ask for them, right? Because it's always better to ask for it and then to see what happens, especially if you think that going into court is an option rather than not asking at all. Video footage, I've gotten raw video footage from the Broadcasting Board of Governors that oversaw Voice of America. So, you can get sound recordings. Let's get really creative here. And then finally, if we just go one slide after, under federal FOIA, as well as about a third to a half of the states, you can administratively appeal an adverse determination. So just make sure you're saving rather everything related to your request. If you use an online portal for a federal agency to submit your records request, there's no guarantee that it's going to spit back to you a verbatim example, of a verbatim copy of what you submitted, which is going to make it harder when you come to an attorney like me and say, hey, I want to litigate this. If I don't have an exact copy of what you sought, then it's going to be extremely difficult. So save everything. It can only help rather than hurt, and you don't need a lawyer to do an administrative appeal. But once you've exhausted those administrative remedies, it triggers your right to sue, and that's where we come in.
Right. Well, apologies for not importing your slides into the deck, and I'm glad we would scramble. Thank you so much. We've got a couple questions. Let me just check. This is Wired reported that DHS is deliberately mislabeling certain final documents as drafts to avoid FOIA scrutiny. Are there any tactics that reporters can use if we suspect records we request and are reasonably certain exist are being mislabeled or obfuscated? That's for anybody to take, but go ahead, Gunita.
That's a really good question. So I'll say that in a pleasant surprise, Justice Barrett of the U.S. Supreme Court, in a decision from a few years ago called Sierra Club versus Fish and Wildlife Service, which dealt with the propriety of withholding drafts. She even specifically said in that Supreme Court case that the label draft is not dispositive. And Ellen, if you don't mind going back to that slide that has the fishbowl, that's actually directly on point, because the whole reason that an agency would try to withhold a draft is under the FOIA exemption called the deliberative process privilege. But FOIA was amended in 2016 specifically to make it harder for federal agencies to withhold records under the deliberative process privilege. And what this means is the foreseeable harm provision added to FOIA in 2016 says it's no longer enough for an agency to just call something a draft or to claim it's deliberative or to say it came before a final decision. The agency now has the specific burden of demonstrating that reasonably foreseeable harm would, not could, but would flow from disclosure of the record. So, Matthew, if all DHS is saying is that this is a draft, then in your administrative appeal, you want to cite to the foreseeable harm provision, and you want to cite to this amazing language from a appellate court case that the Reporters Committee litigated, where the court said you need a focused and concrete demonstration of what the actual harm is. And if you haven't done that, then you cannot withhold this record. And in terms of, what else you can do if you suspect that records exist but are being mislabeled, that's where you can use language in your FOIA request that says, I'm seeking records reflecting XYZ or records sufficient to show XYZ. If you don't happen to know after researching the FOIA reading rooms or, doing a word search of other cases, if you don't happen to know what that form is called or who the author of the document is, all records reflecting the number of, XYZ. So that should be helpful. But again, if you have any other guidance, reach out through the Reporters Committee hotline.
Yeah. And please, if you have other questions, put them in there. I just want to ask all of you, if you could pass on one piece for getting started, what would it be? I think this does feel sometimes like such a daunting issue, but you all come at this from different perspectives. So I'll start with you, Sarah. One piece of advice, where to start?
I think I would start with something you already have a little bit of anecdotal information about. So for instance, if in your area you're concerned about, you've heard a lot about families being detained, you might go in that direction. If you've heard a lot about dreamers being detained, and in particular, if you know of one event that triggered a lot of activity, either in court, the kind of work that Nicole has been doing, or in deportations, or in money. just one event that you can think of that you could then learn and what that will do, I think, is first it proves a great story if you can follow up on one event. And the second thing is it'll teach you about the record systems on something you already understand. So you know what the ground truth is. Now you have to see how they're reflected in the different sets of records. And that'll teach you a lot about the records and how to get started.
Yeah, I want to kind of both answer this question and answer a really good question in the chat about Andrew asked about this woman who has said that she was detained for 2 days by ICE and there's no records. If it's the one I'm thinking of, I'm blanking on her name right now, but I think she's from Skokie. And DHS has come out and said she's lying. There's reporting saying that she has a history of making some false reporting stuff. I think that this is a really good example of this case in that one of the problems with the government becoming a more untrustworthy than usual source. You can never trust them fully. They are an agency that has its own agenda that we are supposed to investigate. But is that it also makes it really difficult when there are people running scams. There are people who are trying to get attention for whatever reason possible. I will say I will not claim that I knew this was a story was a little bit messy before, but I remember the first thing I thought of when I saw some stories come out and see that about this and saw that she had texted her family saying, "Oh, I'm being moved to an ICE facility now from the airport." That rang a bell for me because I have never seen a citizen keep their phone for any period of time. The only people who managed to get out messages to their family were ones who had their Apple Watches on and were like handcuffed, like talking into their Apple Watch until their Apple Watch got taken away. So it's just like it's hard though. These things are happening. And this is again one of the things that like local journalists were covering these issues first in your own communities. You guys have sometimes just the most difficult job because I get to come in months after and be like, oh, look at what we all know. We know all this information now, months later. And so, but I think too that sometimes I feel like I see a panic that happens when there's an immigration raid, when there's a protest. And I just think it's really important that you treat immigration reporting, whether you're looking at citizens, you're looking at people detained in local jails, and you treat it like a beat like any other, which is you learn how things work in your area. What jails do ICE detainees usually get taken to? What are the routes they take? Who are your local contractors? How much money does your jail or this group make? For this, who are the groups that usually get called? Like when I was doing initial reporting in Chicago and there was just like tons of stuff going on and I was just trying to get like an estimate count, I was calling around to the National Lawyers Guild who were representing many of the citizens who were getting detained at protests and held. And I was asking them, okay, like in LA and in Portland, people were disappearing for days, and that was largely because of like an overwhelm in the system. What are you guys seeing? And they said, oh, we're not, people are getting out in like less than 24 hours. This was at the time I talked to them. Less than 24 hours. However, they are showing up in every random federal building like in the Chicagoland area. Like we are finding people in basements of the FBI building and they're getting released, but they were only there for 10 hours, so not as long as other people. It's different in any community, and also it will probably change year to year. Like if you're going to cover immigration long term, you have to figure out how things work in your specific area because it is changing sometimes every month, and it is going to be vastly different than your state next door, depending on whether like what kind of resources are in your state. And sometimes the really great national data from like data project may not be relevant to your area because immigration is working on a different like in a different way. And so it's just really important to treat it like a beat, know the important people and know how systems work because it's probably not working the same way it is in California or Texas or Minnesota.
Yeah. I'm going to go to just a couple of questions that were in the chat. I'm working on a story now where a woman says she was detained for 2 days by ICE, but there are no records of her detainment, and they're claiming she's lying. She is maintaining this happened and that they did not book her or sign her in at the detention center. Are there any ways to verify her story?
Yeah, this is the one I was talking about with
Oh,
Andrew. Yeah.
okay,
So
great.
yeah, and I guess I didn't finish. I mean, I think I think that there's a lot more to be done in there, like just between you and me and everybody, like something that pinged me and I haven't seen local reporting on yet, but I'm not the expert, I might have missed it, is that I noticed that DHS put out the screenshots of their footage of her entering and exiting on wherever she was being held. And it's been very sloppily redacted and it like they've like used like Microsoft Paint and you can see that the numbers have been like replaced. That is something to push them on. I mean, I think that's something to push them on is to get that raw unedited footage. And I don't know, maybe Gunitha, you can talk about this, but I know that there are sometimes workarounds that you can get where like they don't want to release the data, but you can get permission to go and view it. And so that you can't, that way you're not like distributing like people's personal information. But that's something to push for. Also, too, like from what I remember reading, this young woman has kind of dropped off the face of the earth and is not speaking to reporters anymore. Um, Sometimes that will answer the question, but I think it is hard. Like you need photographs, you need like I've had a crazy story of a kid who said ICE took his phone and sold it into a vending machine, but he was like tracking it bit by bit as the phone moved from like on his Find My iPhone like to the vending machine where he eventually found the phone. And then he had a local police report that was filed in order to get his phone back from the vending machine. And then he took a photo of the police pulling it. I mean, it's just one of those things where like it's there's no one way to track how these situations are true, but like really ask people to provide all of the evidence that you can because you may not know what is helpful. And luckily, everybody's taking selfies and stuff on their phones these days. It helps a lot.
Yeah. One more question. Are there any local records, local PDs, cities that you'd suggest requesting that could help show how ICE operates in and or communicates with local entities?
Uh, it- that's just going to be entirely dependent on the state or municipality that you're working with. But for, ideas on how to start the brainstorm, go to the Reporters Committee Open Government Guide.
Okay.
No, I'd just
Um,
add that I mean, one place to start is the ICE on their website does have a list of jails that are in what's called the 287G program. So as long as you're not in a state that doesn't allow those, you can get started knowing at least whether or not there's a formal agreement between ICE and your county. The other thing you might look at is where people are being detained. A lot of times you can see that they're being detained at your local jail. And so you know that they're being paid for this. They're not doing this for free. I think that some of the money stories associated with this are becoming some of the most important ones and probably the easiest ones to get at, because you can get the money through your local governments as opposed to through ICE. Um, you should be able to get those payments reasonably straightforward way.
I put this in the chat, but I'll say it again here. You often before ICE or Border Patrol will do a enforcement operation in the area, they will call into local dispatch and tell them, "Hey, we're going to be doing like stuff in this area. So if you get crazy calls, that's us." And they don't do that always anymore, especially in areas that they've termed, like as sanctuary jurisdictions or like they don't believe local police are helpful. But sometimes they just do it just to cover themselves and say, like, hey, we told local police we were going to be here. You can get those. I believe they might be called differently in your area. They've often been called like local interdiction calls sometimes. Or you can also just get 911 calls or any calls from federal agencies into dispatch. But those can be really helpful. Like we've gotten names of officers that way. We've gotten like, what did local police actually know about this operation that they did? We've gotten dispatchers saying things like, good luck, let me know if you need any help in a sanctuary city that is not supposed to be, interacting with ICE that way. So there's a lot that you can get just from filing those requests for those calls.
Great. Well, we've gone a little over, but thank you so much. I know there's so much to talk about here. Sarah, Nicole, Ganita, thank you so much. Just a few final notes. Again, we're going to post links to all the resources and the full deck that everyone mentioned to the FIJ site. We'll also be sending it out in our email. And everyone who registered, you will get all this information and a link to the webinar as well. Again, reminders, we have the next deadline for FIJ grants, both the seed grants and the regular grants is April 27th. And actually, our next webinar, which is April 8th, is going to be specifically geared to those of you who are seeking an FIJ grant this round. We're going to focus on what makes like a very, very strong pitch and investigative story. And so we hope you can join us for that. Again, questions, resources, go to the FIJ website. Everyone, thank you so much for staying on a little bit longer. Thank you to our guests. This was really, really great and very important. Thanks again, and have a great day. Bye-bye.